Welcome back to Foodie Down Bronx. I'm your host, M, the Hungry Dominican. There are as many as 20,000 street vendors in New York City, from tacos, hot dogs, and shish kebabs to t-shirts and flowers. You name it, and street vendors have it, and they make a part of the incredible New York City culture hub. But in the midst of International Street Vendor Day, celebrated on November 14th, a video has recently surfaced online showing the arrest of two well-known churro ladies in the city. But what exactly happened, and what are street vendors' rights? The Street Vendor Project is part of the Urban Justice Center, a nonprofit organization that provides legal representation and advocacy to various marginalized groups of New Yorkers. Joining us now to provide more information is Matthew Shapiro, Legal Director of the Street Vendor Project. Matthew, thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So we have a lot of important topics to cover, but before the show started taping, you told me that your parents are from the Bronx. So you've actually spent a lot of time in the Bronx growing up. Which part of the Bronx are your parents from?
So my parents were both born and raised in Pelham Parkway on either side of it. So I have a lot of memories. They moved to Miami in the late 70s, but growing up in Miami, we'd always come visit New York 3 or 4 times a year, and mostly we would be staying in the Bronx because that's where my grandparents lived, both sets of grandparents and also great aunts and uncles. So yeah, my childhood is full of trips to the Bronx to visit my extended family. And so the Bronx has a special place in my heart.
It's very, very cool. Before we move on, are there any parts of the Bronx that you just have, besides Pelham, of course, that you have a really close, wonderful memory of?
So my cousin still has actually an outerwear store on Southern Boulevard in South Bronx.
Very cool.
So while my parents, grew up further north and we would spend time in Pelham Parkway, we'd always go visit the store down in the South Bronx. So that has another soft spot.
Awesome. So I had stated in the opening remarks that there are 20,000 vendors in New York City. And of course, it's an array of the type of vendors. They sell different products.
Right.
Can you explain to me a little bit about what the Street Vendor Project is about and how they represent those 20,000 vendors?
Right. So the Street Vendor Project functions sort of like a union for all of the vendors that you see working outside. We do a lot of organizing to build a strong community of vendors so they'll have a better say in the laws and policies that affect them. And we also provide legal and small business services to help make sure they know their rights and also help their businesses stay viable.
So is it sort of like a grassroots type of thing where you go to them and you advise them of their rights?
Very much so. We have, organizers who are on the streets, walking around various parts of the city, talking to vendors, making sure they know about the organization, trying to get them to become members so they'll participate in our actions and events, but also letting them know of the services that we provide. So
you asked them to become members of the Street Vendor Project, and through that they have accessibility to workshops, to meetings, and like you said, it works like a union.
Right.
So they're informed often enough about what sort of opposition they might be facing when they're in the streets.
That's right. We have membership meetings every month at our office, and vendors from all over the city come. We talk about our current campaign work, what's happening out there on the streets. They have access to free legal counsel if they need it. Vendors, there's lots of enforcement issues about, against vendors in the city, so they'll come in with various legal issues that they need help with. We also have walk-in hours at our office during the day, so vendors can come in at any time and bring their issues.
And I'm assuming that some time is spent at 149th Street, right here in the Bronx. There's so many vendors in that location. So that's how it works. You guys go from borough to borough, and you speak to these vendors, and you inform them of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it can be somewhat random depending on what's happening at the time. We could say, oh, well, we know there's a bunch of vendors at the hub, for example, so we'll go up there and spend an afternoon walking around and talking to every single vendor that we see, making sure that they know about the organization, trying to get contact info, inviting them to our office. Or if there's something happening in a particular neighborhood, we might go out to that neighborhood to respond and talk to the vendors there to see what's going on.
Wonderful. So let's get into the arrest of the two churro vendors, both in Brooklyn. Right. These women were their arrests were caught on tape. Their situations were all over social media. Right. And that sort of started this conversation now that we're having that you had mentioned. Usually when a vendor gets arrested, it's either no news coverage or very little, and we sort of just move on from the conversation. Right. And it's not the case with these two arrests, and also extending to the gentleman that was arrested in the Harlem station. And you had said that because this directly connects to the over-policing of the subway systems, the conversation seems to be more on the forefront. Governor Cuomo said that there was a lot of quality of life issues in the subway systems, and a lot of finger pointing and blame is put upon all of these politicians or people who are in charge of certain departments. At the end of the day, what do you think is the major problem that's happening in the subway systems when it comes to these vendors?
Right, well, I think that's exactly right. Vendors are far too often seen as a problem or something that we need to deal with. They're not very often seen as what they are, small businesses. So whenever there's an issue with vendors, the police are always the ones that are there to respond. And I always thought that was, I'm used to it now. I understand that's what happens. I'm always wondering, why that is. For example, if there was an issue with a restaurant that they didn't have proper signage or something, could you imagine the police going into a restaurant and it becoming a criminal justice issue? That would never happen. But because they're street vendors and because vendors have always been immigrants and always been sort of more marginalized compared to other populations in New York, the police are the first ones to respond, and then we end up with incidents like we saw last week with the churro vendors.
So do you feel that this is more of a targeted type of situation where the sort of like the strong arm of the law is sort of emphasized more on these immigrants who are vendors?
It's funny. I don't think that there is I think that vendors have always dealt with enforcement. It just so happens that this was caught on tape. But vendors deal with similar issues all around the city, whether they're getting tickets or kicked out of their spots or, unfortunately arrested sometimes. That's been happening for years and years. So I think the fact that it was caught on tape and the fact that now we're talking about all these issues in our transit system and the addition of 500 new cops in the subways, all these different issues have combined to make sort of a perfect storm, which has rightfully fueled outrage over what's been happening.
Right. So a lot of the official reasoning for the extra 500 cops was that the MTA was losing a lot of money because people were beating the tolls and they weren't paying for their fare. But then we see what we see on these tapes where everything's been directed to seemingly all these vendors, and yet fare evasion doesn't seem to be ever going away. It's a problem that's going to be consistent with the MTA. So do you feel that adding an extra 500 cops was even worth it, considering that, again, people will evade the fare, and now it seems like they're just targeting something else to sort of justify their existence in the subway system?
Yeah, it seems like a misdirection of resources, considering we're at a time now where the transit system needs such additional help in terms of maintaining, its schedules and make sure the trains are running on time. I feel like that should be the focus of any other resources that are put into the system, not hiring additional police officers to chase away churro vendors or stop people from jumping the turnstiles.
Right.
I think there are other better proposals. We have the Fair Fares initiative, which I think once it's rolled out, to more people, will allow people who can't afford the $2.75 to buy discounted fare. But I think there'll always be some portion of people that can't afford to ride the subways.
Right.
But I think that if we can focus more on maintaining the trains and making sure they run on time, that would be,
I agree with you on that one.
That'd be a better use of resources than
Absolutely.
Bothering folks that are selling candy or churros.
Yeah, absolutely. So a spokesperson for Mayor de Blasio had sent out a tweet during the time of these incidents with the churro ladies, saying that the MTA should be policing the situation. The quote is, "We're calling on the MTA to designate zones where food vendors can sell their goods, freeing up our officers to focus on keeping New Yorkers safe." Then another tweet sent out by the MTA's chief communications officer fired back saying, "That's not what the MTA does. We are responsible for running a safe and secure transit system. The recent incidents with vendors involved unlicensed vendors. The city has not raised the cap since the 80s. I want to get into that. So there are actually caps put in place allowing a designated amount of permits given off to vendors. So meaning that if you want to be a vendor in New York City, it's sometimes a crapshoot to even get a permit to legally vend. When were those caps put into place? Because I have found different references going from either 79, 83. So it was around that time period, but when exactly were they implemented?
Right. Well, you're right on both counts. Depending on what type of vendors we're talking about, the caps were put in place at different times. So we can break street vendors into two generally distinct groups. We have food vendors, and then we have general vendors, which sell non-food items, merchandise, things like that. And there's a limit on both the number of licenses for general vendors and also the number of permits for food vendors. So those are the two items that you need in order to be a general vendor or a food vendor, and they're both limited, they're both capped. So in 1979, a cap was placed on the number of general merchandise licenses at 853. There's a special exception for veterans, but if you're not a veteran, the cap is 853 for general vendors. And then for food vendors, a cap on the number of permits was put in place in 1983. And depending on what type of permit you're talking about, there are anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 permits for food vending in the city.
So let's get into some of the permits that I found some information on. So it says that there are 2,800 full-term citywide permits valid for a 2-year period.
Right.
Then you have your 100 full-time citywide permits exclusively for disabled veterans.
Right.
Then you have your 200 full-term borough-specific permits. Right. 50 permits available for each borough, other than Manhattan, valid also for 2 years.
Right.
Then you have your seasonal permits.
Right.
How much do those permits cost? Do they vary in prices depending on which ones you get? Your full-term, your seasonal, your veterans? How much is the price point?
So if you're a permit holder, if you actually hold one of these permits, you get it you've gotten it from the city many years ago, and you renew it every 2 years at a cost of around $200. So you pay $200 to the city, you get the permit for 2 years. Now, all of these permit holders, maybe they used to be vendors many years ago, but now they're by and large not vending anymore. Maybe they have another job, maybe they're retired. So what they do is they rent out these permits on an underground market. So the vast majority of all the vendors you see working out on the street, if they're working on a cart or a truck that has a permit, that permit is not in their name. They're leasing it from somebody that has that permit at a price between sometimes $20,000 or $25,000. Wow. So a huge markup from the city price. So that's because the demand for these permits are really high and the supply has been kept low since 1983. So that's why we have this underground market.
So how is that still a thing, right? I mean, we know they exist, right? I mean, you're here talking about them, so it's not like it's a secret. It's sort of known that there's a black market for these permits. Why is there no crackdown on that?
At various times throughout the years, there have been attempts by the city to infiltrate and stop this underground market. The Department of Investigation did a whole operation a number of years ago, but they were unable to do anything about it. And I'm not sure of the exact reason, but they said they couldn't find a strong enough connection between the permit owners and the permit renters. There was not enough proof to actually show they were renting out the permit. Because you could think about it, right? If you have a business, you could have different partners in the business, and each partner could bring something of their own to the business. So you could have one partner that has the permit, one partner that has the cart or the truck, another partner that's managing the operation. So it's very hard to prove that they're physically giving over the permit, to someone. That's difficult because of the whole sort of gray area and the way the businesses can operate.
Sure.
So I think maybe that's why the city hasn't been able to do anything about it. A far more easier approach would be to just increase the number of permits available to make the underground market go away. So that's what the street vendors would like.
One of the I suppose the loudest critics for allowing to give away these, or not give away, but permit more permits is the mayor. He's saying that if we did that, then that would just create this, this idea that anyone can get this permit without having maybe proper evaluation, or just allowing more vendors to come in. And I guess it's like another quality of life issue. What do you feel about that? Do you feel like that would actually create that situation where just now, you have, let's say, extra slots to allow these vendors to get permits? Will the quality go down? Or just open up the entire market?
It really depends on your perception. And I think going back to what we were talking about before, vendors have sometimes been seen by certain groups of people in the city and by certain governments at various times as a problem or a nuisance or something to deal with. But I think the vast majority of New Yorkers, everyday New Yorkers, would see vendors as an amenity and as enhancing their quality of life, not as a quality of life problem to be dealt with. So I think the fact that anyone could become a vendor is actually a good thing, because vendors have always been mostly new immigrants coming to this country, and they should be given the opportunities to sort of get a foothold in the economic industry in New York City. It's difficult coming here for the first time to have $1 million to open a restaurant, or $500,000, whatever it costs. But if you can get a permit from the city at a reasonable cost and have a 10 by 5 foot push cart on the street and start a business that way, that's economic development. That's entrepreneurship. The city should be encouraging that. We've had, numerous examples of popular businesses that have started off as street vendors.
Right, correct.
It's funny, the Wegmans just opened up in Brooklyn, right? That was started from a produce cart. So all of these good examples and things that we want to encourage, but because of this limit, because of the barriers to entry, it makes it so difficult for vendors to even get a start. So that's why we think lifting the caps would be a good idea.
One of the biggest forms of opposition that vendors get are from these brick and mortar stores, these restaurants, that believe that if there's a vendor that's parked in front of their shop, that they're basically undercutting their own business. Is that something that, are there actual numbers for that? Can we lean on that to be the truth, or is that a situation in which, because brick and mortar stores, have a physical space and they're paying their rent and they're paying their taxes and they're paying whatever they're paying, the city can sort of be a little bit more lenient on them and hear them out more and sort of give them an unfair advantage to get their voice heard versus the vendors?
Well, I agree with you that there's a narrative out there that says that restaurants and brick and mortar stores are against vendors. But the research that we've done and all of the history and the time that we've spent talking to both brick and mortar stores and vendors, show that clearly isn't true. In fact, we believe, and we've found out, that most of the vendors and brick and mortar stores have a complementary relationship, right? When you have a street that's full of vendors versus an empty street, you're more likely to walk down the street with vendors because it's more interesting, it's eye-catching, and that will bring more foot traffic to that block, which results in more business for everyone, the vendors and the brick and mortars.
Right.
Back in the late 1800s and 1900s on the Lower East Side, there were tons of pushcart markets. There were peddlers, mostly Jewish and Italian back then, selling all sorts of goods, and whole streets were full of vendors. And there was an effort back then also to clean up the streets and to move all these vendors inside into enclosed markets. And when that happened, the documents show that the brick and mortar stores and the shops actually complained that they saw less foot traffic because people weren't coming down to those streets anymore to go shopping because the vendors were gone. So there's a real synergy there between vendors on the street and brick and mortar businesses. And I think that there's this sort of false narrative out there that there's unfair competition. It's not unfair competition, right? This is New York City. Yep. There's customers for everyone. It's true, restaurants and brick and mortar stores pay a lot in rent. They have a lot of expenses, but they also get a lot more. They get relatively large spaces. They get heating and cooling. They get tables and chairs for their customers. What do vendors get? They pay a lot less, but they also get maybe 10 feet of space outside, no heating, no cooling, no tables and chairs for their customers. So they're getting a whole lot less too. So it doesn't seem unfair to me. It just seems like a different market. You might have someone just needs to get a quick bite to eat or can't afford to go into a restaurant, so they're able to get a $5 plate of chicken and rice from the vendor. I never saw the situation where someone is like, oh, let's go to this restaurant and have lunch or dinner, and then they're walking and they see like a food cart and say, oh no, let's just grab something quick. If you want to go to the restaurant, you go to the restaurant. If you want to get something quick from the food vendor, you go to the food vendor. So this is New York City. There have always been food vendors. There will always be food vendors. There have been restaurants and stores. There will always be restaurants and stores. So there's enough to go around.
But I'm assuming you still probably do talk to some folks here and there that could say, I do have a problem with this vendor being in front of my store or in the same block.
Yeah.
It's might be a false narrative, but I've talked to some business owners who've had problems with certain vendors But I would look out the window and I would be like, but he's selling bananas and you have full cuisines here. So I don't really know. And again, it's always two sides to each story, of course. But I just wonder if it's a situation where, because it's a brick and mortar, they might have, more of their voice might be heard more than a vendor.
Exactly, right. So it all depends on sort of how the balance of power exists in New York City. The restaurant industry has a strong lobbying group. Brick and mortars tend to be more organized and more informed and have more connections to politicians in New York City than street vendors who tend to be from more marginalized and vulnerable populations. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. And yeah, there are times that we hear from brick and mortar stores that have concerns about vendors. It's extremely rare that we'll have a vendor that's selling the exact same thing that the brick and mortar store. Vendors by nature are selling more limited items versus brick and mortar and restaurants that tend to have more expansive menus. So it's very, very rare that you have a vendor selling the exact same thing that a brick and mortar store is, where they're only selling that item. So yeah, and it just doesn't really happen. But yeah, we do hear concerns from brick and mortar stores, and in individual cases, we hope to work out and actually just bring both sides together so they can hear from each other. Right? That's what you said. There's two sides, so we need each side to hear each other out, and then hopefully to come to some agreement.
Right. Before we go to break, I wanted to ask you, we're in New York, 5 boroughs, of course. Which of the boroughs has the most street vendors?
Good question.
Well, I would say, I'm sorry, I would even say that let's focus on 4 boroughs, because I don't really know,
There are some in Staten Island. It's definitely not the most populous in terms of vendors.
Yeah.
We don't have data. People ask all the time, exactly how many vendors are there? And we don't have data because of these limits on the number of licenses and permits. There are lots of people that are taking a risk and doing it without a license or without a permit. So we don't know the exact number of vendors. We have that estimate between 10 and 20,000. But I don't know. So because of that, I don't know exactly which borough has the most number. But if I had to guess, I would say Queens. There seems to be a lot of areas in Queens that have high density of vendors. So I would guess that Queens might have the most number, but I can't tell you for sure.
It seems like it. When I walk through the borough, I'm like, there's a lot of vendors here. All right, excellent. Guys, grab yourselves a snack. Foodie Down Bronx. We'll be right back.